That was News at 10. Coming up, the press preview, including this story on the front of the Times. Boy fights for life as ministers deny drugs. That's the headline there. Tonight, we're joined by the political leader writer at the Financial Times, Sebastien Payne, and the writer and academic Dalia Gebrial. That's coming up. Hello again, you're watching the press preview. A first look at what's on the front pages of Saturday's papers. In the next half an hour, we'll see what's making the headlines with political leader writer at the Financial Times, Sebastien Payne, and the writer and academic Dalia Gebrial. Thank you very much for being with us. A very good evening to you both. This is a remarkable story that we're going to start with, upskirting. We're going to discuss that in a moment. Let's just have a look at what some of the other stories are in the papers. The FT says Beijing is planning to retaliate over the tariffs that have been imposed on the US on Chinese goods. The Times reports on the story of 12-year-old Billy Caldwell, who's been admitted to hospital after his cannabis oil medication was confiscated by the Home Office. In the Eye, World Cup footballers complain they're being kept awake by the short nights at their base in northern Russia. The Star leads on the news of the death of EastEnders star Leslie Grantham. That story is also on the front of tomorrow's Sun. And in the Mirror too, a tribute by his co-star Anita Dobson. The Telegraph says employers are asking their staff if they went to public school as part of a government drive to improve diversity. The Express reports on a new plan to end so-called bed blocking that costs the NHS £3 billion a year. And the Mail says grieving families are unfairly being charged thousands of pounds by banks after some customers were sold what it calls rip-off wills. And we are joined tonight by Sebastien Payne and Dalia Gebrial. Dalia, let's start then with that upskirting story. It is a remarkable story, isn't it? And one Conservative MP, described in the Express as a dinosaur, has scuppered it, or at least for the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I'm surprised that no one went for Minister Pervert. None of the headlines went for that. That seems like an easy goal. Basically, there was this bill that was introduced as a private bill because it was seen as so uncontroversial to ban upskirting, which, as you explained, is basically taking pictures under women's skirts without them knowing in public space. And it was blocked by one individual who actually has a really long history of filibustering bills that specifically addressed issues faced by marginalised people, including a debate on Hillsborough, protecting renters from revenge evictions by landlords. And, it's kind of a wonder that this guy got knighted just a year ago by Theresa May when he has this history of filibustering bills that are for people that need to be protected. 85% of women aged 18 to 24 experience street harassment. It's not just a violation of privacy, it's a violation of rights, because women need to be able to feel that they can walk through the streets feeling safe and not feeling like they're going to be degraded without even knowing. So I think that I'm glad that we're seeing cross-party condemnation. I'm frankly shocked that it's 2018 and this isn't illegal already. But I think we also have to ask questions about why this man has been, knighted just a year ago for his political and public service when this is part of a long-standing pattern.
Do you think the rules need to change? That it seems very archaic, doesn't it, that one person can bring this to a halt?
I think so. This is Sir Christopher Chope. We've actually not mentioned his name, and I think we're going to see, a lot of condemnation about this. And why does this matter so much? Well, apart from all the things that you've just outlined about why it's a disgraceful practice, the Conservative Party is desperate to be shown that it's in line with modern Britain and it's keeping up with social attitudes. And you get this guy, a total dinosaur, who has been out to pasture on the back benches for the best part of 20 years now, who appears and does this, and it's all over a procedural thing, because these private members' bills you mentioned, essentially, they get put through without a lot of scrutiny. And his argument, if he was sitting here, would be to say, oh, well, we need to do legislation properly, we need to get a proper scrutiny, committees, whatever, so I'm going to block it. It's absolutely outrageous. I think it's a total disgrace, and I think he should. Why is he still in the Conservative Party? It's also other people as well, his colleague Philip Davies MP. These people think it's a game. It's not a game, as you were just saying. This is harassment that women have to suffer every day. And this was a really simple, straightforward piece of legislation that would have fixed it. And instead, he's playing games. And I think it was one MP who just described this as dinosaur, pure and simple, time to take his pension. And I think what's amazing is the condemnation, the strongest, has actually been from Theresa May, who took to Twitter this evening, she doesn't tweet very often, to say, we will make this bill law, and I'm disappointed and disgusted with somebody in her own party. It's absolutely incredible. Again, it just shows what an absolute state the Conservative Party's in at the moment.
Yeah, the campaigner, Gina Martin, who brought this legislation, says obviously extremely upset and disappointed, but she does remain positive, though, that eventually it will go through. Let's move on to another story, if we may. Sebastien, this is in the Times, page 4. Brexiteers made to pay for NHS victory with trade concessions. Now, this is all about that bus, isn't it? The famous Brexit bus and that £350 million a week we were all promised.
Yes, we'll never forget that bus, I think, for the next sort of 10, 20 years, or the rest of our lives, maybe. But this is all coming up to July the 7th, which is the 70th anniversary of the NHS, and it's currently in a massive cash crisis. It desperately needs new funds to keep it on the road, and the government's been trying to find some money down the back of the sofa, wherever, to do this, and it looks like it's going to happen. It could be announced on Sunday, could be announced on Monday. It's going to be between 3 and 4% extra a year, which, if it's 4%, that would be another £21 billion a year. So this actually would represent one of the biggest fiscal moments in modern British history, putting all this extra money into the NHS. The question is, where is this money coming from? Brexiters are desperate to say it's a dividend from the EU, which is total rubbish. There's no dividend from the EU at all. There's no, money will start going down that we give to the EU, but we're still paying £39 billion as part of the exit payment. But Theresa May is being nice to the Brexiters and is saying to Boris Johnson and all the others, you can tell people it's a Brexit dividend if it makes you feel happy. But the fact is, it's not. And there's still going to be a big debate about, is it going to be more borrowing? We've still got a huge deficit in this country. Is it going to be tax rises at a time when cost of living is very tight? So I think it's great hay for Labour as well, because Labour will come along and say, we've said we needed this for ages. It's good to see the Conservatives catch up, and they'll just promise even more money.
But we could see more tension in the Cabinet even over this, couldn't we? Some believe the government may also cancel planned reductions in corporation tax, and that's going to anger Philip Hammond.
Yes. And because, again, in this age of Brexit Britain, we want to be open for business, appealing to lots of different people. But with, these corporation tax cuts are precisely the kind of thing that rile people, and there will be a good use of that money. So it's a very careful balance between government and the Treasury on this.
Sticking with the NHS, the front page of the Daily Express and the headline, bed blocking costs the NHS £3 billion a year.
Yeah, so this is off the back of a report made by a Labour peer, which is basically saying that free social care should be offered to all pensioners who need it. Now, the key distinction to make here is that social care is not the same as the NHS. Social care is not provided free at the point of need, and it covers things like dressing, eating, washing that elderly people need in their old age. Now, I absolutely welcome this recommendation. I think we have a complete crisis of care in this country, and it's affecting the elderly. It's also affecting children as well. And this will have so many benefits. And firstly, it will help to solve the situation of our ageing population. It will mean that elderly people will be more able to stay at home, to stay in their communities, rather than having to go to hospitals. And it will also help to relieve some of that pressure of the NHS, because it means that everyday caring maintenance is not being allowed to accumulate before it becomes a real health crisis, but rather people are being looked after in their old age, as they absolutely should be, by the government. And it's important to say that as well that, the burden of this lack of funding for social care and the fact that elderly people are having to face care home bills of more than £100,000, which most families can't afford, means that a lot of women in particular in families are taking on a lot of this unpaid care labour, which is having knock-on effects on their quality of life. So I absolutely welcome this report, and I think it's really important that the Conservatives wake up to the crisis of care in this country.
I think the only slight thing with this report is that it basically wants to do it by removing means testing on social care. Again, that's a lot of money that you're going to be needs to be pumped into the social care system for that to actually happen. And I think, at the last general election, the Conservatives tried to put forward this proposal of trying to fix social care, which was instantly decried as a dementia tax. And this is what happens. You try and have a grown-up conversation about social care and healthcare, and it just becomes party political politics. So I do hope this can begin a proper conversation, because you're right, something really does need to be done.
OK, Sebastien, Dalia, thank you for the moment. Still to come. How does Beijing plan to respond to Donald Trump's $50 billion trade tariffs? Stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching the press preview. With me now, the political leader writer at the Financial Times, Sebastien Payne, and the writer and academic, Dalia Gebrial. Hello again. Let's start with your paper, Sebastien. The FT, in this headline, China to hit back over $50 billion tariffs.
So we're not quite into a trade war yet. We had a good debate at the office about what defines a trade war. And I think once we get over the next round of this, then it's definitely a trade war. It's trade skirmishes between the US and China.
Is that how the FT describes it? Trade skirmishes?
Skirmishes, yes.
You had a big meeting about this.
Well, you've got to decide these things, because a war is, quite a drastic thing here, and how many exchanges does it count anyway? Donald Trump feels the US is getting ripped off by China because they have a big trade surplus. So he's brought in these tariffs, and we're now into the second round of this, which is £50 billion worth of trade is going to be $50 billion over trade is going to be hit with these latest tariffs. And it's cars, helicopters, bulldozers, industrial machinery, all going to be affected from new tariffs that are coming on the 6th of July. And China, not surprisingly, has promised that it's going to hit back just as much. What's really bizarre about this is Donald Trump seems to separate out his personal relationship with President Xi of China, which he says is very good and very cordial, with this trade dispute. And the thing is, I think this is an absolutely horrific thing. This is going to be really bad, and it could plunge the whole world into a recession, because protectionism, we know where that ends. It ends up in everybody being worse off. But it was the most popular thing Donald Trump said on the campaign trail. Every rally he said, we're going to bring in tariffs, it's going to make America great again. So he's actually doing something that he promised. I think it's bad, and I think it's going to be really bad for everyone. But I guess he's kind of doing what he promised he was going to do. I like
the comment from one senior US trade official who says it's a misnomer to label anything China now does as retaliation. He says they're the ones who started it.
It's really grown-up stuff, this.
Yeah. OK, let's move on then, Dalia, to the Times, page 6. Councils failing to discipline bad landlords.
Yeah, so we have this story which basically shows that Freedom of Information requests showed that 100 councils are basically unwilling or unable to act against road landlords which are providing dangerously substandard accommodation. And I think anyone who has rented before, particularly in London, knows the absolute state of housing that you can end up in. And that's because landlords don't really have an incentive to keep up conditions unless there's actually someone forcing them to, because for them it's much more about keeping costs down and keeping rents up. So, we also need to think about how this long line of legislation, going back to New Labour, has progressively reduced tenants' rights in favour of landlords. And I think part of that, we need to think about the fact that 1 in 5 MPs are private landlords. What impact does that have on the direction that housing legislation is going in? And I think, 1 year after Grenfell, and we're not seeing any sort of serious policy moves in the way of making sure that housing conditions are universally at least safe, as well as being dignified. Now, obviously, it's different because that's council housing and this is private landlords, but as a whole, we are finding that renters and people who are actually tenants are being really just kind of swindled by the entire system.
But isn't the problem here not because there have been new powers introduced? I believe it was under the coalition government these came in. So it's not that authorities don't have the powers, it's the fact they're not using them. Well,
part of it is obviously because of budget cuts, but we're also seeing that prosecutions and implementation, yes, is a problem, but that is also it's being able to get that far because of lack of resources as well as lack of policy.
And one thing I just found very fascinating briefly on this is that, there was a whole culture in Britain of Rachmanism, which was essentially landlords bullying their tenants, living in substandard property. And this resulted in the 1965 Rent Act, and this all came out during the Profumo scandal. And ever since then, the power has moved more from the landlords towards the tenants. But as you're saying, you're right, it's gone in the other direction. And the story here of a tenant who had to protect her name in case she got shipped out is really, really bizarre. Something drastically needs to be done, and counties need to get their gumption up and do something about this.
Yeah, I mean, it really is a shocking situation. Listen, we've got one more minute, Sebastien. I do just want to cover this story. It's on the front of the Telegraph. Purge of the middle-class fears at top firms. People being asked whether or not they went to public school.
I think this is a really bizarre idea, and it's just the kind of thing that emerges from the heart of the civil service, which is trying to solve something with a really bad idea, which is essentially asking people what kind of school they went to. And the idea is to try and,
Is that legal? Is it even legal?
It's at the moment, it's sort of thing that could be challenging human rights law, but it's certainly against the British culture of meritocracy, which is not about where you came from, it's about where you are and where you grew up to. You know, I used to work at the Spectator magazine, and we instituted a policy of having no CVs. And I think that's the way it should be going, not telling people, where did you go to school? It's very un-British.
OK, all right. Thank you both for the moment. We'll see you again in an hour or so's time. Coming up next on Sky News at 11, all the headlines. Do stay with us. Hello there, you're watching the press preview. A first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. In the next half an hour, we'll see what's making the headlines. Today with the political leader, writer at the Financial Times, Sebastien Payne, and the writer and academic, Dalia Gebrial. So let's take a look at some of those front pages for Saturday morning. The FT says Beijing is planning to retaliate over the tariffs that have been imposed by the US on Chinese goods. The Times reports on the story of 12-year-old Billy Caldwell, who's been admitted to hospital after his cannabis oil medication was confiscated by the Home Office. Here's the front page of the Eye. World Cup footballers complain they're being kept awake by the short nights at their base in northern Russia. The Star leads on that news of the death of EastEnders star Leslie Grantham. The same story on the front of The Sun. And in the Mirror too, with a tribute by Grantham's former co-star Anita Dobson. The Guardian reports that Oxfam is looking to make millions of pounds of savings as the charity struggles to deal with the fallout from the sexual misconduct scandal in Haiti. The Telegraph says employers are asking their staff if they went to public school as part of a government drive to improve diversity. Here's the front of the Express. It reports on a new plan to end so-called bed blocking that costs the NHS £3 billion a year. And the Mail says grieving families are unfairly being charged thousands of pounds by banks after some customers were sold what it calls rip-off wills. And as I said, we are joined tonight by Sebastien Payne and Dalia Gebrial. A very good evening again. Nice to see you. Sebastien, let's start with this story. It's an unbelievable story, really. It's something that a lot of people may not have heard of before. Upskirting, this horrible practice where men take photographs, usually on their mobile phone, up women's skirts. And legislation was going through the Commons, a private member's bill, to stop this practice by making it illegal. And yet it's been stopped by a Conservative MP.
Yes, this is Sir Christopher Chope, nicely pictured here on the Daily Express, who has a big problem with private members' bills because he feels they don't give legislation the proper scrutiny and they're often pushed through on Friday mornings when no one's really watching without sort of getting the proper things you'd expect for a piece of legislation. So, as per he's done with this and many other private members' bills to address legitimate concerns, he blocked it. And it's pretty disgraceful stuff, actually, because this bill was introduced by a Lib Dem MP. The government was all behind it. Everybody expected it to go through. It was briefed out. It was going to go through. And he just looks like a complete fool, to be quite honest. You know, and the comments from Conservative MPs have been absolutely visceral against. You know, even Theresa May has taken to Twitter to say she is disappointed and disgusted at what's happened here. So you've got to ask, what kind of future is there in the Conservative Party for this guy who's been on the backbenches for a long time, and the only thing he seems to be adding to our debate is by following some nitty-gritty policy procedural thing when there's a real legitimate problem here that should have been addressed. You know, the Conservative Party is desperately trying to look in step with modern Britain and tackle these kind of crimes, yet instead the headlines across several newspapers tomorrow and across the website are saying this one guy has stopped this thing, but Theresa May and the government has said we will get this into law eventually, but it's pretty bad PR.
So his issue isn't so much upskirting. His issue is a procedural one, but nonetheless, this is such an important topic, isn't it? And everyone assumed that it would sail through because it is so disgusting what is going on. And we were talking earlier, and you've had experience, or certainly known people who've had this experience.
Yeah, so I think, one thing that I really want to say is that like 85% of women aged 18 to 24 have experienced some form of street harassment in Britain. The thing with upskirting is that, as we saw in the CCTV earlier, sometimes it can happen to you and you don't even know. But what I want to say is that when you are harassed in the street, it really hampers your ability to participate in social life. You become nervous walking down certain streets, walking in the dark. I know so many women who plan their entire nights around making sure that they can get home in a way that means that they don't have to go down certain streets at certain times of night. And, just in the commentary section on the same page here, we have Nick Freeman saying that one thing that women should do to stop this is not wear short skirts. Is he really suggesting that a price that women should pay for the freedom to wear what they want to wear is that they don't feel safe walking the streets of Britain today? It's absolutely absurd. And it goes to show that, yes, this seems like one guy who's just out of touch, but this attitude of, well, how did you, as a woman, how did you invite what happened to you, is still so prevalent, and we need so much more education and responsibility being laid at the feet of the men who do this.
Sebastien, do you think procedure needs to be looked at in the House of Commons, that it's actually possible for somebody to stop a private member's bill that everyone agrees needs to go through simply by saying they object?
It is important to have private members' bills as part of the parliamentary system because it's a way of getting non-government legislation onto the books, essentially. As I said, this came from a Lib Dem MP. The way this happens, I think there's certainly going to be some examination of that. But I think there's also a question about what on earth was Theresa May's government doing? Because they told everybody, it was in all the papers, this was going to sail through, it was going to get the support of the government. They were very pleased about this. Yet they know that Sir Christopher and his colleague Philip Davies, who also objected to private members' bills, always do this, as you were saying earlier. Every time these bills come through...
Well, there's a list of them here. He's voted against safeguarding wild animals. He's voted against protecting police dogs. He's voted against national standards for taxi licences, all things that most of us would like to see.
Yeah, and I just think, if this is what you go into politics to do, to stand up and stop legitimate bills going through that will help the social good of the country, you need to ask yourself, what on earth are you doing? What's the point?
I'm sure that will run that story. But let's move on, if we may, Dalia, to the Times. And this is a story about rogue landlords, and it's becoming a real issue, isn't it?
Yeah, so what this report shows is that councils and local authorities are basically not able to act against landlords who are putting their tenants up in unsafe conditions. We can see here that more than 200,000 renters are evicted every year for complaining. So that basically means that tenants are too afraid to come forward because there's no regulation or ability to enforce the regulation that already exists to protect tenants when they do raise grievances. And so it's really a combination of policy, which over the past sort of 5 decades has progressively gotten worse for renters, and resources. And, anyone who knows about renting, I've lived in 3 cities in the past 4 years, and in every case, it's not just a question of London. It's all over the country. In every case, it's been an absolute nightmare finding accommodation that is reasonably priced and is actually just safe to live in. I
was down at Grenfell for the 1-year anniversary on Thursday, and when you speak to people there and you hear about the conditions that many people are living in areas like that, you wonder why, year on, it has taken so long for us to be having the discussion, but there's been no change in legislation.
Exactly, and I think that's what I've been finding very frustrating. It's all well and good to light up the London Eye in green a year on from the disaster, but what we're not seeing is the policy and the commitment of resources, we need accountability for landlords. We need things like rent caps, and we need to make sure that more affordable housing is built and that the conditions of that housing is not only livable and healthy, but dignified. People should have access to things like public space, should have access to nearby public parks, and not have, all of the space around them eaten up by private contractors, building things that no one asks for and no one can really access. It's a really multifaceted crisis.
I think we shouldn't forget the role of local authorities in this as well, that, that the local authorities were given powers to clamp down on councils, and the heart of this story is they're simply not using them. And yes, they have suffered from budget cuts and they've got a lot of other things to think about. But if you go back to the tale of Grenfell, a lot of it comes from the mismanagement by Kensington and Chelsea Council and how they outsourced it to their tenant management organisation, who didn't listen to tenants. And there's another example here, tenants who are raising problems, floorboards that are not safe to live in, electricity that's not safe as well. So why aren't councils, they've been given the powers by government, this is what it's meant to be about, to really do things about us. I'm not quite sure I agree that rent caps are necessarily one thing there. I think we need a lot more housing to be built because, a lot of the reason we have bad, dilapidated housing, people are forced into whatever's available because we're just not building enough.
Yeah, I mean, the study found that 100 councils received almost 60,000 complaints from renters in just 1 year. I mean, that's a staggering statistic. Let's move on to your newspaper, Sebastien, the FT. China to hit back over $50 billion tariffs.
Yes, so the skirmishes between Donald Trump and China are now ramping up a bit. So we're into round 2 now, which is $50 billion worth of tariffs are hitting things from cars, helicopters, bulldozers, lots of things there. And what's fascinating about this is Donald Trump has a very zero-sum view of diplomacy, that, he has a very good personal relationship with President Xi, as he loves to tell us all the time. It has no problem with putting tariffs on that could well pull China's economy out of growth and into recession. And if this keeps going, develops into a full-blown trade war, and it could pull the whole world's economy into recession. And, I think it's a dreadful thing. He claimed coming off office to be a pro-business president that was going to stimulate the economy, and yet he's doing the one thing that we know always limits economic growth, which is protectionism and trade tariffs. But to his core supporters in the middle of America, he said time and time again, I'm going to come in, I'm going to bring in trade tariffs, and it's going to make America great again. And that's what he's doing. So I suppose on the one hand, he's doing what he's promised, but on the other hand, I think it's going to have really bad consequences for the US and for China and for everyone else.
And you and your colleagues at the FT don't call it a trade war yet, you call it a trade skirmish.
Indeed, we're trying to figure out what exactly a trade war is, because it's probably since the 1930s since we had the last proper trade war. At the moment, this is round 2. If we get into round 3, so China's going to hit back, that's the end of round 2. If Trump then goes again for round 3, the FT will declare it's a trade war.
The FT will declare it. OK, thank you both very much. We're going to take a short break. We'll speak to you again in a moment. Coming up, how Oxfam plans to make £16 billion worth of cuts. Stay with us. Hello again, you're watching the Press Preview with me, the political leader writer at the Financial Times, Sebastien Payne, and the writer and academic, Dalia Gebrial. And Dalia, we're going to start with the front page of Saturday's Express. Bed blocking costs the NHS £3 billion a year.
Yes, so this is off the back of a report put forward by a Labour peer, which basically says that free social care should be offered to all pensioners who need it. And this is in response to a crisis that is costing the NHS £3 billion a year. Now, I think I absolutely welcome this measure. I think it's really important, and a lot of people don't realise that social care and the NHS is very different. So social care, which is things like helping people with everyday tasks like dressing, washing, eating, these things aren't covered by the NHS. They aren't free at the point of need, and they can cost people more than £100,000, which is not obviously viable for most families. But we really have a crisis of care in this country, and it's affecting the elderly. It's also affecting children. It's affecting the disabled. It's also affecting people who have mental health care issues. All of these things that require a kind of long-term maintenance form of treatment.
How is it going to be fixed?
Well, we need to really invest the money because in the long term, it's much better because it helps to relieve the pressure on the NHS. Because what's happening now is that problems are being left to kind of stack up until they reach crisis point, and then all of that pressure goes onto the NHS. Whereas distributing it more evenly and doing more preventative work in the community, allowing people to stay in their communities for as long as possible, which is what most elderly people want, is a kind of way of evening out the costs rather than having this mounting crisis in the NHS.
And we do hear stories, don't we, Sebastien, quite regularly about people who are stuck in hospital for months because they haven't got a space in a care home.
Yeah, you know, the NHS is facing huge challenges simply because our population is ageing. People are living a lot longer, and you face these very tough questions. Where and what is the best way to care for people in their elderly age? I think the only thing I sort of do wonder about this story is essentially it wants to remove means testing for social care at the moment, which we still have in. And I think doing that would be hugely expensive, you know, and aside from social care, the basics of the health service need a huge amount of money investing, which we're probably going to hear more about from the government next week, just to keep it going. Social care does need a long-term solution. There's been talk of a Royal Commission or big investigation. And don't forget, in the election last year, the Conservatives put forward proposals about how to do this, but they were instantly pulled apart and rubbished as a dementia tax. And yes, they were ill thought out, but they tried to have a conversation. We do need to get to a point where we can do this in a cross-party manner, because I think when it just becomes party political, it just gets into point scoring. It's far too serious for that.
Let's move on, Sebastien, to The Sun, if we can. The headline, 7-year hitch.
Yes, so this is back to Brexit, and obviously we've had a week where there's been a lot happening and nothing happening. We're essentially exactly where we were, which is that Theresa May has not got her crucial piece of legislation through the House of Commons, with keeping her Remain side of her party and the Brexit side happy. And this is all about the Irish border. This solution called maximum facilitation, which essentially is using drones and cameras and things like that to keep the Irish border smooth. It could take up to 2025 to get that done. That would keep Britain tied into the EU's customs union to that period. Why is that problematic? Well, it's past the next general election. That means more money going to Brussels during that period. It also means we can't negotiate our future trade deals in that time as well. But it shows how complicated this whole thing is going to be. And people who blithely say, oh, it's fine, we can go it alone, we'll just leave the EU and do these things. It's clearly fanciful talk here. But one person who has clearly got this right is Hayley from Love Island, because the other little story we've got here is it was remarked, they had a great discussion, which I recommend viewers go and look up, about Brexit on Love Island, which was far better than most of what you hear in Westminster.
She first of all thought it was something to do with trees, didn't she? And then she was worried about...
But she is right. The EU has actually come out and said, as per The Sun, that Stefan de Rink, who is Michel Barnier's chief policy advisor, has dug up some EU legislation to show that post-Brexit, Britain's tree protections will not be as they were. So Hayley, bang on the money.
Hayley from Love Island will be
Sign
happy. And just very quickly, Dalia, we've got about 45 seconds just to talk about scandal hit Oxfam. It's going to make £16 million of cuts.
Yeah, so basically this is the fallout of the huge crisis of public trust in Oxfam following the scandal, the sex scandal that we heard about earlier this year. And what I would like to say about this is just that this is a sector-wide issue. These huge NGOs, some of my fellow campaigners call them MUC NGOs, that tend to be so huge and so full of cash that they're so much more preoccupied with their brand, which can lead to things like cover-ups rather than actually doing what they are being paid to do by the public who donate. So this is what happens when you lose trust in when you lose the confidence of the public.
Plenty more on that story in The Guardian. Sebastien, Dalia, thank you both very much indeed. Good to see you. Have a pleasant weekend. Right now, we're going to take a look at the weather.